My role is to introduce Steve Larkins. There's a very good summary of his multifaceted career in the bulletin, so I'm not going to repeat that. Instead, I want to tell you a short story, and Rob a very short story. On Wednesday, 12 September last year, something very special happened for Diane and me. We found ourselves at the Voici Novotel Hotel in Paris, and progressively we met up with Gwenda and Steve Larkins, Carol and Ian Proctor, Kim and Peter Neal, Sandra Turner, Nick Egan and Bob Carney. And a special welcome from me to Gwenda, Nick and Bob from that group. It was special to meet up with old friends and also to meet new ones. But it was even more special to learn of another set of skills of our very own member, Steve Larkins. I had known Steve for a number of years, but this was the first time I had experienced firsthand his considerable skills as a tour leader. We're about to embark on a Western Front to Normandy battlefields tour, and Steve's passion, knowledge and presentation skills had our group of 17 or so on the edge of our seats each day waiting for more. But rather than me say any more, I would like to invite Steve to tell us the story of that 13 days, and more importantly, of the battles that we were to learn about in a manner that only Steve can do. So it's over to you, Steve, and please welcome him.
Thanks, Barry. As we approach Anzac, I just want to make a couple of quick comments. There's been a lot of stuff in the press about how much money we've spent on commemoration. And there's all sorts of pros and cons. I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, what people need to understand about this is 100 years ago, this conflict on the other side of the world touched every family, every community, every organisation in ways that we can't imagine now. From a population of less than 5 million, we recruited 330,000 volunteers, sent them overseas. 1 in 5 never came home. Of the ones that did, 50% were dead within 20 years. You think about that now and extrapolate that in terms of our population and our place in world affairs. And secondly, there's a few historians saying, well, our part in World War I wasn't that big. You know what? That's not the point. It's about what happened to our community and what we need to take away from that. The next thing I want to say is the internet has changed history because it's taken it out of the hands of closeted academics and put it back in the hands of the people whose families made it. To stress that point, I'd just like to acknowledge the efforts of my very good friend and colleague Bob Carney. He single-handedly, actually with a couple of other people, but unpacked one of the great mysteries of the First World War. The loss of 80 or so men from a South Australian battalion who apparently just disappeared on the battlefield. Everyone just accepted that, but Bob didn't. He got down and undertook primary source research and has accounted for every single one of those people. Now that's important for the families of those men and in some cases women. So that's why we do this. And as I said, I wanted to acknowledge the importance of two things: genealogy and an interest in where we live. It's really important in an increasingly diverse society. I'm working with some kids out in the western suburbs, the most diverse group of kids I've ever seen. But if you want something to resonate, just relate it to where they live. And when they find out one of these people lived in their street, it engenders a whole new level of interest. And we owe it to those people to know a bit more about it. So, as Barry mentioned, there's a group of Rotarians joined a tour group I took to France last year. Lots of battlefield tours go away. I don't want to hit you up with a huge volume of facts. I want to leave you with an impression of why this is important. In the course of this 12 days or so, we made personal commemorations for 12, they were all men, the people that were commemorated. But there have been women, not as many as is now the case in the Defence Force, but particularly in the health and medical services. who didn't come home either, and in not actually, the fact that none of our group were related to any that had not returned in this instance is just the way it is. But I can tell you right now, on most trips, it's amazing the connections that are made. That's Villa Bretonneux. You're all familiar with it, and I'll talk to it a little later, but whoops, right now. This is a ground brief. I used to do this to everyone every day, just so you know where you are and what's going on. Okay, this is France, that's the UK, that's the English Channel, and there's a couple of important points. Calais, shortest route across the Channel. Below the bottom of the map is Paris, down here somewhere. And here's a whole lot of ports down the French coast, called collectively the Channel ports. Here is the city of Amiens. Its cathedral's even bigger than Notre Dame, and as old. Up here in Belgium, we've got, on the border, Lille, Ypres over there, Brussels here, Ghent there. Now, there's three sectors. They're the places that Australian soldiers were committed to in the First World War. So we arrived, met in Paris, oops, I'll stand well back, and headed north. Unlike most battlefield tours, I take people to a few other sites that give them some context. And the first of those was Arras, my favourite French provincial city. It's got everything. It's a beautiful place. But like many of these cities, it's endured occupation. We'll never, hopefully, grasp what it means to be occupied by a hostile foreign power. Arras knows all about it. Not in the First World War, but certainly in the Second. I take people here because most of you are familiar with the desolation of the Western Front and the mud and all the rest of it. Arras is important because an alternative strategy was developed there. They went underground, big time. 25,000 men lived underground, 30 metres below the surface, to get them out of all the misery of what was up above ground. It is quite something to behold. It goes back 300-400 years. These were quarries, and the British realised they were there, and they got New Zealand tunnellers to join them all up. 12 kilometres of enormous spaces, as you can see. So this is about context. The next place I take folks to is this, the Mur de Fusilee, the Wall of the Shot. Those plaques are 241 members of the French resistance executed in the moat of the citadel of Arras. Northern France has been traversed by invading and conquering armies since time immemorial, and most of them have big fortifications. Arras is one. That's what was the moat, and in there, from 1941 to 1944, the Germans executed 241 locals. A lot to be learned from that. I can't dwell on it because I don't have time. But if you're ever up that way, you have to go there. Another geography orientation, the Somme. Where is that? Well, that's Amiens. Up here is a town called Bapaume. They're joined by a Roman road. Why is it a Roman road? Well, it was a Roman road. It's been tarmac now, but it was arrow straight, as was this one here, which goes to a town called St Quentin, or you would pronounce it St Quentin, and another Roman road which takes you down to another town called Roy. Anyway, the Australians' interest in this area is basically described by that triangle, and then push out another 50 k's to the right at the very end of the war. That is the Somme River, and here at a very important point, Peronne, it turns, well, it's actually flowing that way, so it's coming north and then it turns west to head to the Channel. So in there, in 1916, our Australians were up here, and in 1918, they were part of an advance that went from here to there in very short order and kept going. I won't dwell on that because I just don't have time, but suffice to say, that's one of the most important actions of the war because it ended it, pretty much. So we base ourselves in Peronne, beautiful little, it's not a city, but it's a large town, fantastic. We had a rustic hotel and some restaurants nearby and so on, but we're right in the middle of it. And just around the corner is this place. It's a medieval fortress called l'Historial. It's important on two counts. One, the history of the place. Again, it stands on one of the key byways of northern France. But in 1918, Australian troops recaptured it, and that was it. But it's also important from another point of view. I first went there in 1998, but only very briefly. But 2008, I was with a very large group. That's the French National Museum of the First World War, l'Histoire de Grande Guerre, and there was not a mention of Australian troops' involvement, despite the fact that we'd actually liberated the town in 1918, and that's because we're all classified generically as British. That's changed a lot. That's our group. It's an amazing museum, and again, if you ever get the chance to go, I'd endorse it thoroughly. We had a fantastic host, Dominic Frere, who's a great friend of Australians generally, and it is a very beautifully presented facility, and it was 150 metres from our hotel, so very pleasant. We then go through a bit of a chronology, and I'm going to blitz through this because time is of the essence. That is a mine crater. Those dots are people, and this is one of the points on the Western Front where on the first day of July 1916 the British attacked and lost 20,000 men killed in a day. It does beg a belief on a whole range of dimensions, but you need to see these places to understand what happened. Fortunately, a British farmer actually bought this block of land, otherwise it would have been filled in long ago. But it makes a huge impact when you realise, crikey, this was happening up and down the front. Despite the enormity of that, it wasn't successful, and the Tyneside Irish and Scottish battalions that attacked there were absolutely decimated. And pulling all that together is this place. This is the British National Memorial at Thiepval, and it's their memorial to the missing. Inside the arches of that building are engraved the names of men who had no known grave. It's our Villa Bretonneau, except much bigger, because it was the scale of the British involvement. That was the focal point of all those operations on the 1st of July 1916. They didn't capture that till the end of September. And in a space that you can see from one side of the ground to the other, 30,000 lives were lost in very, very short order indeed. Our little piece of that is a place called Pozières, and that's our group. If you were close enough, I'd conduct a competition to spot the Rotarians. Over half the group were, which was pretty good. So Pozières was the site where our troops were first committed to the Western Front. 5 weeks later, 5,000 men killed, 23,000 casualties. If you put that into perspective with Gallipoli, 8 months, 8,000 killed. This all happened almost in the twinkling of an eye. So socially, you can begin to imagine what was going on at home. What had started out as a great adventure was turning into a nightmare, and it kept going. This is the other part of Pozières, a little farm called Mouquet Farm. Every year they plough up thousands of unexploded shells, and they still are. It's amazing, this legacy that's persisted for over 100 years. Not every travel group goes to this place, but I made a particular effort to contact the owner, and we got there, and I think everyone would agree it was one of the features of the trip. That was Monash's headquarters, where he ran the war as far as the Australians were concerned from May 1918, after having staved off a very determined effort to have him unseated as the Corps Commander by Charles Bean and Keith Murdoch at the time and various others. But he did what all good commanders do if they're going to keep their job. He won. So we were privileged to go here. Having met the owner, you do become somewhat humbled when you learn that the grounds have been in his family since 1100. It's a magnificent building. They run it now as a convention centre just to keep it going. It is that's the man there, Stanislas Clement-Tenaire. He was a gracious host and gave us a personal guided tour of this magnificent building. Later on, we had a chance to walk around the grounds, and we conducted a reenactment. That, of course, is the spot where King George V knighted Sir John Monash, so I doubled as King George V, and Bob Carney very graciously filled in as John Monash. But you can't but be humbled when you stand in a place like that. The next point I want to make is a South Australian connection, and a very poignant one. You're probably not aware why we've got the town of Dernancourt over the road. The reason is we established a very close connection with it. From the 28th of April to the 28th of March to the 5th of April 1918, but before that and subsequent to it, it had been a transit area. But between those two dates, in late March, early April 1918, it was the focal point of an all-out German attack to finish the war. The Australian 4th Division got thrown in there and managed to repel and blunt those attacks. And as a consequence of it, a unique relationship was formed. That's Peter Neal and Kim and a couple of others of us down the back there. That's a little cemetery called Millencourt. And in it is Harold Flinders Mitchell, the father of Dame Roma Mitchell. So he was killed there in the defence of the town in late March. I didn't actually realise that until I started doing a bit of research. But there you go. And of course, because we were going over there and there's an official relationship between Adelaide and Dernancourt, I did approach Martin Hazy, our honorary member, and it turns out Dame Roma was his godmother. So that was a pretty poignant connection. And we were able to mark that in a very dignified but also very engaging way. That's our group in front of their cenotaph and the school called Pavilion Adelaide. And the reason it's called that is because funds raised in Adelaide in the early 1920s rebuilt the town. So it's very similar to Villers-Bretonneux, but far less publicised. But anyone from South Australia going there needs to go to Dernancourt. And you'll be very graciously hosted by these folks. That lady's the current mayor, Monsieur Lionel Lamotte. He's got more moves than a Swiss watch. But he's also a close friend of former Lord Mayor Jane Lomax Smith, and she effected the introduction. Absolutely marvellous guy, and they hosted us beautifully. Right, now I really have to crack on. Sir John Monash Centre, a lot of money spent on it, and it's a bit controversial. Let me say something. Before this, there was nothing in France of any consequence to explain the Australians' role there. So I have a view that, well, it's about time. The quantum of money, I'll leave that for the accountants to fight over, but we owe it to our community to understand what took place. It is an amazing thing. You need to allow a lot of time. I personally was formed the view that you could go back there a couple of times, but I will be taking the next group in there just to get a feel for it to start with. It's a spectacular thing. The people who've done it best for longest were the Canadians. More on that in a minute, because now I really have to get going. These are all significant features of the landscape, and they're all quite close. L'Hamel, where Monash won his first victory as the Corps Commander and kept his job. Because if he lost that, it would have been all over. Mont St Quentin. This is an amazing piece of real estate because it makes you understand the scope and the absolute capacity that the Australian military had reached at that point. I won't bore you with the details, you'll have to come on a trip to learn the whole lot, but 3 divisions manoeuvring around here in an attack that they didn't think could succeed. It did, and totally dislocated the Hindenburg line. Now, people have argued that Monash drove his troops too hard. He may have, but it probably saved more lives in the long run. There were 2 sides to this conflict, and every now and then you get a touch of what that meant to the other side. I will make the observation that they did start it, and they did invade France 3 times. This was the second. They did it again in 1940. But the German graves, cemeteries, this is Masonry, 44,000 men interred in there. The biggest Allied cemetery is 11,000. Some spectacular geography. This is the Hindenburg line on the line of a magnificent canal, and you can see why it would be. If you're defending on this side and you're on here and you have to get across, it's pretty untidy. But they did, and the Australians actually, underneath where the photograph has been taken is a tunnel, so it goes underground. That helps a lot because it means you can go over the top. But the British captured a bridge just down the way here, and you just think, how the hell did they do that? Nevertheless, a marvellous piece of geography, also a spectacular piece of industrial engineering for those of you who've got a bent that way. If you've got questions, you can ask me later. Canada. Canada's story is very similar to ours. A dominion, like India, sent lots and lots of soldiers. They suffered inordinately high casualties because most of their soldiers were frontline infantry or cavalry troops. Their story is almost identical. 20% lost. They have this spectacular memorial at Vimy Ridge, but they staff them with students that are rotated through those memorials each summer, and it's a fantastic way to inculcate that understanding in your younger generation. Fromelles, you've all heard about it. That's the battlefield. Nowhere to hide. This place was the first exposure of the Australians to the Western Front. 2,000 men killed overnight. That's a quarter of what we lost at Gallipoli in 8 months. Staggering. And it touched a lot of people in South Australia, the 32nd Battalion being the South Australian Battalion. That's the memorial which I had the great pleasure of being the Guard Commander to open that in 1998. I didn't think I was that old, but obviously I am. But it's a place that every Australian needs to visit. Totally nondescript. There's not much to, I suppose, define it other than what happened there. Now, we undertook a bunch of personal commemorations. This is Carol and Ian, who you'd all recognise, and one of a number of relatives that they commemorated. But the ability to be able to go here, trace the story of these men, what they did, where they went, and where they finished up in these beautiful but very poignant and tragic cemeteries it's an experience that if you're connected with it, you just need to do. Menin Gate, Belgium, the Belgian equivalent of Villers-Bretonneux, and our group got to take part in the wreath-laying ceremony that night. A spectacular place. That building was a medieval cloth hall, rubble after 1918, rebuilt to the plans held by the city fathers inside the very considerable walls that protect the city. And then we went to Normandy. Now I'm going to flash through this because time is tight. I take people to Normandy for two reasons. One, the endeavour that was generated. There weren't that many Australians here. More than you might think, though, as I'll soon illustrate. But when you are one of 30 men stuck inside that thing, which is like a furniture van with wings, no engine, they got towed across the channel at night, released over a target, and they put three of these, one behind the other, within 50 metres of their objective, sort of epitomising the Trojan horse. They won, and they did what they went to do, which was to hold or capture the bridge intact and hold it until they were relieved, which they were. You would not do it in a fit if you thought remotely about it for a moment. But Bayeux is the centre of Normandy, and where one invasion landed in 1944, another departed in 1066. That's another humbling thing. That's 70 metres of tapestry. It's a thing. 75 years later, these are the remnants of the artificial harbours built at Normandy. They're still there. That was at the beach just out from our hotel. And one last thing. Here's an Australian, Stanley Black. He was aircrew in a bomber that was tasked to raid the hinterland of the beachhead. And they did that, but his aircraft got shot down. He and one other man were the only two to get out. The other man, they never saw one another again because they were kilometres apart when their parachutes descended. He was taken in by a French family. He said, "Don't put yourselves at risk. Take me to the nearest Allied unit." He was taken to this little village it's spelt Grain, but pronounced Grenay. Unfortunately for Stanley and the American paratroops he joined up with and the citizens of that town, they were in the way of the 21st Waffen SS Panzer Grenadier Division. They captured the town and they shot everyone. It's pretty hard to kind of grasp some of this stuff, but that's what went on. No one was ever held to account. They burned the curate and his staff in the church, and the nave is all that remains of it, and it's now a memorial to the citizens, the soldiers, and because one of the local citizens spoke out, "What about Stanley Black?" He's up there too. Omaha, synonymous with Normandy. But all of that is why we say this. We will remember them, and we owe it to them. Thank you.
It's really unfair to cut Steve short. It's even more unfair to skip the question session. But something very special is about to happen. We've already had a special talk, but something that's likewise special. So it just leaves me to thank Steve very much. You've got just an inkling of why I regarded that 12 or 13 days as one of the most stimulating periods of my life. So could you once again give Steve a big round of applause?